続きまして、ハーバード大学のジョセフ・ナイ先生をご紹介いたします。ナイ先生は、アメリカ国際政治学の重鎮の一人で、パワーと相互依存、ソフトパワー、スマートパワーなど、斬新な概念を数多く生み出してこられました。また、歴代アメリカ民主党政権で、国防次官補などの要職を務められました。さらに、知日派の国際政治学者として、日米関係に関するさまざまな政策提言をされています。演題は、中国に対する戦略的アプローチです。それでは、ナイ先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back at the TIU Symposium and to realize that with 107 countries represented, TIU is doing its job. I've been asked to address the issue of how we should respond to China, and it perhaps is worthwhile starting with a little historical perspective before I discuss the current period. If you look back over the 74 years of U.S.-China relations since the Communist Party came to power in 1949, you'll notice that the relationship has gone through four quite contrasting stages. In the 1950s, Americans and Chinese were killing each other on the Korean Peninsula. After Nixon's visit to Mao in 1972, the Americans and the Chinese became partners in trying to contain the Soviet Union. China even gave the Americans listening bases against the Soviets inside their territory. If you look at the period from the end of the Cold War, in the 90s and early 2000s, it's sometimes called the period of engagement, the period where the view was that more trade and relations with China would lead to change inside China, which would lead to a more benign China. Indeed, the United States supported China's entry into the WTO, the World Trade Organization. But those three phases come to an end a few years ago. It's hard to date it exactly. Sometimes it's dated by 2017 when President Trump issued a new national security doctrine called the Age of Great Power Competition, but it actually has earlier roots. My own feeling is that what happened is after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, China decided the United States was in decline, and it didn't have to be as restrained as it had in the past. Remember, Deng Xiaoping had always advised that China should hide and bide, in other words, to take its time. This begins to change when the feeling is that the U.S. is declining. It was a mistaken perception, but nonetheless important, and it becomes even firmer after 2012, when Xi Jinping takes power as a committed Leninist or Marxist-Leninist who wants tight party control on everything. So the types of open exchanges that were occurring between Americans and others with Chinese, which was true of the period of engagement, very rapidly dry up. It's less possible to speak freely than it was before. And that's why I think what we're facing now is the era of great power competition. When Trump announced that as his national security doctrine in December of 2017, the argument was that this was a change from engagement, that we were reversing or changing the policy. And what's interesting is that the Biden administration kept that general change that Trump had made, and it even called China, what the term they used for China was the pacing threat. In other words, there was great power competition with Russia and China, but China was the one which was getting the center of attention. So that essentially is the recent history of the U.S.-China relationship. And the debate now is, how should we consider this new period, and what should we call it, and what sort of a strategy should we have? Many people are saying, well, it's really a return to Cold War. And there are a number of people who use this terminology. I happen to think that's a mistake. If the word Cold War means intense competition, then yes, we're in a Cold War. But if the words Cold War means something similar to the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union after 1945, then it's not at all like the Cold War. And it's a great mistake to base a strategy on a historical metaphor which is misleading. Why do I think it's misleading? Well, if you look at the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was almost no trade, almost no social contact. There was a great deal of military interdependence, but little else in the way of interdependence. Contrast that with China, where you have $500 billion of trade between the U.S. and China, the days of the Cold War. So essentially, there was a great deal of economic interdependence today that never existed during the real Cold War. The other thing that's interesting is that not only is there economic interdependence between the U.S. and China, there's also something new, which I call ecological interdependence. If you look at something like climate change, or you look at the recent pandemic, these are interdependencies which don't obey the laws of politics, but the laws of physics and biology. And they have tremendous implications. In the pandemic interdependence, which we just saw with COVID, both China and Russia, China and the U.S. lost over 1 million lives. And while China at first pretended that it could escape this, it obviously couldn't, and Xi Jinping had to reverse his policies. Now, if you look at what 1 million lives means from an ecological interdependence in pandemics, that's, from the American point of view, that's more lives than have been lost in all our wars since 1945. In other words, ignoring this ecological interdependence, it makes no sense at all. And the same, I would argue, is true for climate as a form of ecological interdependence. It doesn't matter where greenhouse gases are put into the atmosphere. They wind up affecting everybody. It happens that historically, Americans and Europeans put the most carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but today the country that's putting the most into the atmosphere is China, by far. And then you say, well, what should we do about that? Well, it's hard to know what you do about it because you can't exactly bomb Chinese coal plants, or you can't put on embargoes on Chinese goods. So it is a huge risk that we're facing. If you think about the impact on China of the Himalayan glaciers melting and the great rivers drying up, or you think about the impact on the United States of cities like Miami or New York with a 6 or 10-foot sea rise, these are the effects of a major war and worse. And so in that sense, we have something totally different than we had in the Cold War, which is a situation of economic and ecological interdependence. Now, with economic interdependence, people say, well, the solution to that is decoupling. But think about it. If you really decoupled the US and the Chinese economies, you would have enormous effects on both economies, but also on the world economy. It would be quite devastating. What you're going to wind up with, and what we're already seeing, is sometimes called selective decoupling, where you're looking at particular areas of security problems or vulnerabilities in supply chains, and those are being cut off. An example, of course, is banning Huawei phones from building the 5th generation telecommunications. Well, that actually makes sense. Huawei could put in a so-called backdoor into its technology, which it could trigger at a time of a conflict. And one could say that's a security risk. Similarly, with the most rapid or high-level semiconductors, many of these can be extremely important in weapon systems. So when the U.S. banned the export of microchips below 7 nanometers to China, that was based on security grounds. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, explained this as building a high fence around a narrow field. The problem, of course, is that the field may expand too much, but it's very different from what would happen if you had total decoupling. So we will see some decoupling, but we're not going to see total decoupling because it's too expensive. Similarly, on the issues of ecological interdependence, as I mentioned earlier, these forces obey physics and biology, not politics, and therefore you have to work with China, not over China. As I've written somewhere, one has to think of power in international relations in two ways. There's power over others and power with others. And some of these issues of interdependence can only be dealt with if you think of power with others. So in that sense, the issue or the metaphor of the Cold War and calling this a Cold War misleads us, because what we need is to have a way to do two contradictory things at the same time. One is to compete, and the other is to cooperate. It's very hard for humans to do two contradictory things simultaneously, but essentially a strategy has to be able to accommodate that. So what would you call this approach to how we deal with China? There are various efforts that have been made for a terminology for it. I rather like one that was suggested by Kevin Rudd, who's former Australian Prime Minister and is now the Australian ambassador to Washington, and who is actually a sinologist who has met many times with Xi Jinping. And what Rudd says in his book is that this is a period which should be called managed competition. Another term that's been used, I heard this from Secretary of State Blinken at the Aspen Strategy Group meetings last summer, in which he says we should think of this as competitive coexistence. I've sometimes called it cooperative competition. The point is that we don't have a good word or slogan like we had in the Cold War of containment, because we have a much more difficult task to accomplish in how we deal with China. So then you have the question of, well, what does it mean and what are the limits to this strategy? One of the important places to start on this is to realize that neither China nor the United States pose an existential threat to the other. China is too big to allow the United States to either invade it or change it, and the U.S. is too strong to allow China to invade it or change it. So in that sense, both China and the United States, while they're strong competitors, are not threats to the existence of the other, unless, and the unless clause is important, unless they stumble into a major war which turns nuclear. That could indeed threaten the existence of both. So the question that we have to ask are, what are the prospects or the possibilities of that happening? One of the examples historically that might be relevant is the prelude to World War I, in which in August of 1914, the great powers expected what they thought would be the Third Balkan War, a short, sharp war. The troops would be home by Christmas. Instead, what they wound up with is 4 years of war that killed 10 million people and led to the downfall of 4 different empires. That is a threat to existence. In that sense, if we're thinking about historical metaphors, we don't want to think about the period after 1946, where you had the Cold War. We want to think about the period after 1914, where you stumbled into World War I. And that means that to develop a strategy for this period of competitive coexistence or managed competition, you have to have an accurate assessment of the balance of power and how does it add up. Many people now are beginning to speak of something called peak China, meaning that because of the slowdown in growth, that China has reached its peak and is now going to decline. Interestingly, just about 2 years ago, it was just the opposite. The Americans were in decline and the Chinese were rising. I think this is an exaggeration, and the danger is that it may lead to hubris, to taking risks that could lead to this 1914 type scenario. So a good strategy for this period of how you describe or react to the current period is a strategy which essentially looks carefully at the strengths and weaknesses of both the United States and China, and which assesses that in a way that is not overly optimistic or overly pessimistic. I would argue that until very recently, the American view of China was overly pessimistic, and now there's a danger that it might become overly optimistic if you believe peak China. I think peak China actually is a bad concept. I think China may reach a plateau rather than a continual rise, but I don't think it's a peak. That's important because if a country is rising or is secure, it's less willing to take risks. If a country feels it's in decline, it's more likely to take risks. Going back to 1914, it was interesting that of all the great powers in Europe, the one that wanted more most was Austria-Hungary, which was a declining country. And if you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin is basically, in my view, presiding over a declining country. Russia is losing population demographically, and its exports are 2/3 dependent on oil and gas. It hasn't coped with the modern information revolution, and its efforts to do so are unlikely because the system is basically a kleptocracy. So if Putin is presiding over a declining Russia, then his attitude of taking a risk, which he did when he invaded Ukraine, makes more sense. If Xi Jinping is presiding over a rising China, or China which is on a plateau, which is doing well, then he does not have the incentive to take a risk in terms of invading Taiwan, because the one thing that would end his rule would be a failed invasion of Taiwan. As Kevin Rudd points out in the book that I mentioned, his book on China, said Xi Jinping would very much like to be the leader who brought Taiwan back inside China. They regard Taiwan as a renegade province, and to be the leader who brought the province back would be a great historical accomplishment. So that's something to worry about. Some people have said that means there'll be a war between the U.S. and China over Taiwan by 2027, or whatever number you want to pick. The trouble with that, as Kevin Rudd points out, is that there's one thing that Xi Jinping cares about more than the return of China, and that's his control of the Communist Party and the Communist Party control of China. And if you ask what is the event which could break Xi Jinping's control over the party or over China, it would be a failed invasion of Taiwan. So in that sense, I think if you have a China which is not declining, but not having a sharp increase, the prospects for avoiding a 1914 scenario are reasonable. It still leaves the larger question of how do you think and organize an international order in East Asia, and what does the balance of power in Asia look like? I've sometimes used the metaphor of imagining a person or creature from Mars who comes down to Earth and sees these two great powers playing a game of poker against each other. But this creature, he or she, is able to peek into the hands of each of the powers and then decide which one to bet on. And looking at the Chinese, the Martian says, enormous success economically. It's developed a huge market. Its market is so big that controlling access to the market gives it power. Look what happened to Australia when they asked for an open and impartial investigation of the origins of COVID. All of a sudden, China kept Australian products out of its market. And it's done that with many other countries. When Liu Xiaobo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, China refused to import Norwegian salmon. So China has power which comes over from this economic success. It also uses that power for aid programs such as the Belt and Road Initiative, where it can buy influence in other countries. So significant power resources. On the other hand, when you look more carefully, you see that China, in addition to these high cards, has some very low cards. One is demographic decline. The Chinese workforce peaked in 2015. Another is its geographical position. It has serious conflicts with a number of neighbors, most importantly with India, which has now grown more populous than China. It's the world's largest country, India is. And in that sense, China has a problem in terms of its own neighborhood geographically. And you also have an energy problem. China is still heavily dependent on imported oil and gas, and particularly from the Middle East, which means imports that have to exit the Strait of Hormuz and cross the Indian Ocean. And guess who has the naval capacity to blockade the Strait of Hormuz or the Indian Ocean? It's the Americans, not the Chinese. So you would look at the Chinese hand and say some good cards, some bad cards. The Martian peeks over the shoulder of the American player and says, well, what do I see there? And for good cards or high cards, the Martian sees that in geographical terms, the Americans have two oceans and friendly neighbors. If you think in demographic terms, the Americans are the only major industrialized economy with population increase rather than decrease. If you look at technology, you'll find that on the leading technologies, biotechnology, information technology, including artificial intelligence, the Americans are still ahead. And if you look at something like the role of currency, while China has been trying to increase the role of the renminbi in international reserves, 60% of reserves are still held in dollars. So, and then your Martians would say, well, what are the problems in the American head? It has all these high cards. What the low cards are is it has internal problems. Politically, it's going through a period of considerable internal polarization. On the other hand, the Martian might say, but the Americans have gone through things like that before. So as the Martian looks over these two hands with two players and decides which one to bet on, I think he would bet on the American hand or the American player, but with this cautionary sense that if you are a player who's been dealt a good set of cards and you play them badly, you can still lose. So that, I think, would be the right way to do an appraisal of the balance of power in East Asia. We should not be too alarmed about the rise of China, which would lead us to take high risks, nor should we be too provocative in terms of not just deterring China, but taking steps, for example, like recognizing Taiwan, which would provoke China on the belief that it had peaked and was in decline. So a sensible policy is one which plays this for the long term. And in that sense, I think the key to order in East Asia and to maintaining a competitive coexistence is to realize that we're going to have to be patient. But if you think about patience, the argument that organizing alliances and organizing multiple so-called mini-lateral arrangements like the Quad, or which India, Japan, U.S., Australia, or AUKUS with U.S., Australia, Britain, that these maintaining these networks, sometimes formal alliances, sometimes partnerships, is the secret to success. We can't expect to change China internally. As I said earlier, it's too big to change. We may be lucky and China may change, but we can't develop a strategy on that. But we can develop a strategy on affecting the international environment in which China behaves to make it act more prudently. And that depends, as I said, on this web of institutions and alliances. And of alliances, none is more important than the U.S. alliance with Japan. I would conclude by echoing what Ambassador Mike Mansfield once said: there's no alliance that's more important than the one between the U.S. and Japan. That, to me, is the secret to how we should approach managing China. Thank you.
ナイ先生、ありがとうございました。